What if the biggest stars in Hollywood weren't hiding glamorous lifestyles, but stories no one was ever supposed to uncover? Behind the red carpets, flashing cameras, and thunderous applause are stories of betrayal, deadly scandals, twisted family lies, shocking crimes, and dark truths buried for decades. Some of these secrets destroyed careers. Others shattered families forever, and a few are so disturbing they sound more like movie plots than real life. Once you hear what really happened, you'll never look at these legends the same way again. Number 1. Jackie Chan. Everyone knows Jackie Chan as the fearless superstar who laughed in the face of danger, shattered bones for the perfect scene, and became one of the most beloved action icons on Earth. But the greatest twist of his life wasn't performed on a movie set. Long before he threw his first punch on camera, an astonishing family history had already been written into his story. The son of an intelligence agent, and a woman once involved in smuggling. For decades, even many of his biggest fans had no idea. Jackie's father, Charles Chan, had secretly worked as an intelligence officer for the Chinese nationalist government. His mother, Li, lived a completely different life before fate threw them together. Charles arrested her during a drug investigation, yet life took an extraordinary turn, and the two eventually fell in love, married, and started a family. Years later, Jackie would discover that the incredible risks he embraced throughout his career almost seemed woven into his bloodline. When he finally learned the full story, he admitted it changed the way he viewed his parents, two people who had survived war, political turmoil, and real hardship before giving him the chance to chase his dreams. Sometimes the most unbelievable action story isn't filmed in Hollywood at all. It's hidden inside the lives of the people we thought we knew best. Number 2. Robert Downey Jr. Hollywood loves a comeback story, but almost no one realizes that Robert Downey Jr. was pushed toward his darkest chapter before he was even old enough to understand what was happening. Long before he became Iron Man, before the Oscars, before billions at the box office, there was a little boy whose childhood was quietly slipping away. Robert has openly shared that when he was around 8 years old, his father, filmmaker Robert Downey Sr., introduced him to marijuana and later alcohol. His father would later admit it was a mistake, saying he believed it was a way of bonding with his son. Instead, it became the beginning of a long struggle. As Robert grew older, experimentation turned into dependency, and dependency nearly derailed everything. Arrests, rehab, lost roles, and public setbacks followed one after another. At one point, Hollywood had largely written him off, but the story didn't end there. After years of battling addiction, Robert rebuilt his life and his career piece by piece, eventually making one of the most talked about comebacks in the industry's history. He has never hidden where the struggle began, using his own story as a reminder that a decision made in childhood can echo for a lifetime. Behind the smile of one of Hollywood's biggest stars lies a lesson that success alone couldn't erase. Number 3. Elvis Presley. World-crowned Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, a man who could make stadiums erupt with a single smile. Millions believed he had everything anyone could want. But behind the fame was a part of his private life that remains a genuinely uncomfortable subject for historians and biographers to this day. According to numerous biographies and accounts from people in his circle, Elvis was drawn to relationships with much younger women, several of whom were teenagers when the relationships began, a pattern biographers have described as troubling by any standard, and one that has become harder, not easier, to look past as more has been written about it. Some of these relationships have been extensively documented, including by women who were involved with him, and later spoke about the power imbalance and the impact it had on them. The contradiction is part of what makes this chapter of his story so uncomfortable. On stage, Elvis radiated confidence and charisma. Off-stage, biographers describe a man who sought out relationships with people who had little power to push back. His talent changed music forever, but that doesn't erase the more troubling parts of the record, and serious accounts of his life increasingly don't try to. Number 4. Charlize Theron, before Charlize. Theron became one of Hollywood's most celebrated actresses. She survived a night so harrowing it could be mistaken for the climax of a crime thriller. The woman who would one day stand on the Oscar stage was once a teenager, trapped inside her own home, listening as violence spiraled out of control. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. One gunshot ended one life and forever altered another. Growing up on a farm in South Africa, Charlize witnessed years of turmoil caused by her father's alcoholism and violent behavior. In 1991, after returning home intoxicated, he threatened both Charlize and her mother, Gerda Theron. Fearing for their lives, Gerda shot him in self-defense. Authorities investigated the incident and determined it was justified. No criminal charges were filed. For a long time, Charlize chose not to discuss that night publicly, carrying the emotional weight in silence while building a new life thousands of miles away in Hollywood. She has since spoken about the experience on her own terms, describing how she transformed that trauma into determination rather than letting it define her. Her story is a reminder that some of the strongest people aren't born fearless, and they become fearless because they've already survived something most people never have to imagine. Number 5, Woody Harrelson. Hollywood has produced countless unforgettable villains, but Woody Harrelson grew up knowing the most unsettling figure in his own life wasn't on a movie screen. For years, Woody believed his father was simply absent from the family. Then a difficult truth became public. Charles Harrelson wasn't just absent. He was one of America's most notorious contract killers. Charles Harrelson drifted in and out of Woody's life before eventually being convicted of multiple murders. His most notorious crime came in 1979, when he was found guilty of assassinating federal judge John H. Wood, Jr., the first federal judge murdered in the United States in the 20th century. While behind bars, Charles made a number of bizarre claims, including that he had been involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Though investigators found no credible evidence to support that, Woody was left carrying a burden no child should have to, watching the world remember his father for violence instead of family. Rather than let that legacy define him, Woody built a completely different career, earning acclaim for performances full of warmth and humor. No amount of success erases the family history, but it's a reminder that none of us choose where we come from, only where we're willing to go. Number 6, Michael Caine. For decades, Michael Caine believed he knew everything about his family, that he had only one brother, and a fairly ordinary upbringing behind him. But after his mother passed away, a revelation turned his understanding of his own life upside down. Hidden behind years of silence was a family secret so carefully protected that not even Michael's own father knew it existed. The truth was that Michael had an older half-brother, David, born years before his parents' marriage. His mother had kept David's existence hidden because he suffered from severe epilepsy and spent most of his life in a psychiatric hospital, where treatment for neurological conditions was often handled at the time. She visited him quietly over the years, but never told her family who he really was, fearing the stigma around mental illness and the circumstances of his birth. Michael only learned he had another brother after his mother's death. Despite the shock, he chose compassion over anger, coming to understand the impossible position his mother had faced in an era when families often hid painful realities from the world. The discovery didn't change the love he had for her. It changed how he understood her. Number 7, Cary Grant. To the world. Cary Grant was the definition of elegance and Hollywood polish. But behind that unforgettable charm was a childhood built on one devastating lie. At just 9 years old, the boy who would one day captivate millions suddenly lost his mother without warning. His father told him she had gone away to recover by the seaside. Later, the story changed again. This time, he was told she had died. For more than 20 years, Cary carried that heartbreak, believing he would never see her again. But the truth was far more disturbing than death itself. When Cary was in his 30s, his father finally confessed. His mother, Elsie, had never died. She had been committed to a psychiatric institution while Cary was still a child, and had remained there for years. Rather than tell his son the truth, his father had fabricated a story to erase her from their lives. Horrified, Cary traveled back to England to find her, and against all odds, she was still alive. Mother and son were finally reunited after decades apart. Friends and biographers have long believed the abandonment he experienced as a child shaped many of his insecurities and relationships throughout his life. Despite becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars, the man the world saw as effortlessly poised carried underneath it a boy who'd spent decades mourning a mother who had never truly left him. Number 8. Matthew Broderick. One wrong turn. A split-second mistake. 2 lives gone forever. For Matthew Broderick, the darkest moment of his life didn't happen under the bright lights of a movie set. It unfolded on a quiet road in Northern Ireland, where a vacation with his girlfriend suddenly became an unimaginable tragedy. In August 1987, while vacationing with actress Jennifer Grey, Broderick was driving a rented BMW when he crossed into the opposite lane and collided head-on with another vehicle. The crash killed Anna Gallagher and her mother, Margaret Doherty, who were traveling in the other car. Matthew suffered serious injuries, including a broken leg and a collapsed lung, while Jennifer escaped with relatively minor injuries. Authorities initially considered a more serious charge, but it was later reduced to careless driving, resulting in a fine. The legal case eventually closed, but emotionally, it was only the beginning. Broderick later said he had no memory of the impact itself, yet the weight of what happened never truly left him. He returned to acting and built an impressive career, but those closest to him say the tragedy changed him permanently. Unlike many Hollywood scandals fueled by gossip, this was a real tragedy with consequences no one could undo. Number 9. Bob Hope for generations. Bob Hope was America's favorite gentleman. He entertained troops during wartime, made families laugh for decades, and built the image of a devoted husband with an impeccable reputation. But according to numerous biographies and accounts from people close to the industry, the private reality was more complicated. Biographers have written that Hope had a number of affairs over the course of his career. One of the most discussed involved rising actress Barbara Payton in the late 1940s. Hope reportedly arranged an apartment where the two could meet privately. When the relationship ended, Payton later spoke about it publicly in a magazine interview, describing details that stood in contrast to Hope's wholesome public image. Even after the stories faded from headlines, the contrast between Bob Hope's public persona and the private accounts that later emerged has continued to interest historians and biographers. His extraordinary career and charitable work, especially his USO work with American troops, remain well documented and widely respected. The affairs, as described in these accounts, are simply part of a fuller, more complicated picture than the public image allowed for at the time. Number 10. Rose McGowan. Before Rose McGowan became one of Hollywood's most outspoken actresses, she spent part of her early childhood inside a world many people would struggle to believe existed. Long before she stepped onto a movie set, part of her childhood unfolded inside the Children of God, a religious group that has faced extensive, well-documented allegations of child abuse, exploitation, and controlling behavior toward its members. According to McGowan, she witnessed disturbing behavior from a very young age within the group. Her family eventually left, and she went on to build a completely different life. Years later, after achieving fame in Hollywood, she spoke openly about those experiences, describing how they shaped her determination to speak out against abuse and exploitation wherever she later encountered it, including within the entertainment industry itself. Escaping the group ended one chapter, but by her own account, it also forged the resilience that defined the rest of her life. Her story is a reminder that the most confining environments aren't always built with walls, and that walking away from one can take real courage. Number 11. Anthony Perkins. To millions of movie fans, Anthony Perkins will forever be remembered as the chilling face of Psycho. Ironically, while he terrified audiences on screen, he spent much of his real life managing a very private fear of his own, not of scandal in the abstract, but of what the truth about his life might cost him professionally, at a time when it could have ended his career. During the height of his career, Perkins was privately involved with fellow actor Tab Hunter. In an era when a same-sex relationship becoming public could end an actor's career, the relationship was carefully kept out of view. Perkins later married photographer Barry Berenson and started a family, though speculation about his private life never entirely went away. In the early 1990s, after tabloid rumors began circulating that he had HIV, Perkins underwent testing and learned the reports were correct. He chose to keep the diagnosis almost entirely private, while continuing to work for as long as his health allowed. Anthony Perkins died in 1992 from complications related to AIDS, and much of the fuller story only became widely known after his death. His final years were marked not by scandal but by quiet, considerable courage. Number 12, Stan Laurel for millions of fans. Stan Laurel was the lovable half of one of the greatest comedy duos in film history. But once the cameras stopped rolling, his personal life was, by several contemporary accounts, considerably more turbulent than his on-screen persona suggested. The most difficult chapter surfaced during Laurel's divorce from his third wife, Virginia Vera Ivanova Shuvalova. Court records and contemporary press reports described a troubled marriage, with Vera accusing Laurel of heavy drinking and violent behavior. How much of the allegation reflected the full reality has long been debated by biographers, and it's worth being cautious about treating a one-sided divorce filing as settled fact. But the allegations were serious enough to make headlines at the time. As part of the divorce settlement, Vera agreed not to publicly discuss many aspects of the marriage, which kept much of the dispute out of public view for years. Afterward, the contrast between the two accounts, the joy Laurel brought audiences on screen and the turbulence described off it, is part of why historians continue to treat the beloved performer and the private man as two separate, only partly reconcilable stories. Number 13. Melissa Joan Hart for an entire generation. Melissa Joan Hart was the girl next door, as the star of Clarissa Explains It All and Sabrina. The teenage witch, she became the face of wholesome, family-friendly television. But years later, she revealed that while America saw a squeaky clean role model, she was privately living something quite different. In her memoir, Melissa Explains It All, Hart wrote candidly that fame exposed her to a much wilder side of Hollywood life at a young age. She described experimenting with drugs, partying heavily, and making choices that stood in sharp contrast to the characters she played on screen, all while trying to manage sudden fame and constant public attention. Unlike many celebrities who spend years denying rumors, Melissa chose to tell her own story before anyone else could. By confronting her past openly, she turned what could have remained a hidden scandal into a candid account of growing up under an unforgiving spotlight. Number 14. Ann Miller to audiences. Ann Miller was the dazzling queen of tap, lighting up the screen with elegance and effortless charm. But behind the glamorous costumes was a personal tragedy that stayed out of public view for years, one she would only fully discuss much later. In her own words, after marrying businessman Reese Milner in 1946, Ann has said she discovered her husband had a dangerously violent temper, which she believed was linked to a serious head injury he'd suffered years earlier. While 9 months pregnant, she has described an argument that escalated to Milner pushing her down a flight of stairs. She fractured her back and went into labor shortly afterward. The baby, a daughter named Mary, survived only a few hours. At the time, public reports attributed Ann's injuries to a car accident, rather than what she later said actually happened. For years, Ann carried that grief largely in private, continuing to perform with the same bright presence audiences knew her for. She spoke about the loss more openly later in life, including in her own memoir, a reminder that a performer's public brightness doesn't necessarily reflect what they're carrying. Number 15. Joan Crawford. Before Joan Crawford became one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading ladies, a persistent rumor followed her for much of her career. She built a public image of elegance, power, and sophistication. But for decades, a claim circulated that one of Hollywood's biggest studios had gone to unusual lengths to bury something from her past. Whether fact or Hollywood legend, the story has followed Crawford's legacy for generations and remains one of the more disputed pieces of Golden Age lore. According to long-standing Hollywood rumor, Crawford may have appeared in an early, explicit film before achieving stardom, and as her fame grew, MGM was said to have tracked down and destroyed existing copies to keep it from becoming public. It's worth being direct about this one. Historians have never found conclusive evidence that the film existed, and no verified copy has ever surfaced. It remains more than anything one of classic Hollywood's most durable, unproven legends, repeated often enough over the decades that many people assume it's established fact, even though it isn't. 15 names. 15 very different kinds of stories, some confirmed by the people who lived them, some still genuinely disputed after all these years. That distinction matters. Not everything whispered about a famous person turns out to be true, and it's worth remembering the difference between what someone has actually told us about their own life and what's simply been repeated long enough to sound like fact.